Hello everyone, this is Jeff at Mississippi in the Civil War. This is episode 2 of Researching Your Mississippi Civil War Ancestor, and today we're going to concentrate on sources about Civil War veterans. In particular, we're going to be talking about pension information and also burial information for veterans who died after the war. And I thought I would start off opening this program with a great picture of a group of veterans. These are members of the 2nd Mississippi Infantry, one of the Mississippi units that fought in the Army of Northern Virginia. They were a hard-fighting unit, saw a lot of action with the Army of Northern Virginia, and they're shown in this picture. These are members of Company B of the 2nd Mississippi Infantry, and this picture was taken in the 1880s at a reunion held in New Orleans. And I just love this picture. You can just see the pride in these old vets as they're standing there with their flag that they had served under for 4 long years. It's just a great image of a group of Mississippi veterans. And whether you're a relative served in the Union Army or the Confederate Army, one of the best post-war sources of information about your relative is going to be a pension. And fortunately, there are both Union and Confederate pensions available for Mississippi veterans. And I'm going to start off by talking about the pensions available to U.S. veterans that served in the United States Army or Navy. And I'm showing you here as an example. This is actually one of the pension documents from a relative of mine, Miles Adams. He was not a Mississippian, but his parents, my great-great-great-grandparents, moved to Mississippi in the 1880s, and their descendants still live here today. But this shows that he was awarded a pension for his service in Company A of the 3rd Michigan Infantry. And this is a picture of him taken post-war wearing a veterans reunion ribbon on his lapel. I really love that picture. It's one of the very few images I have of one of my relatives who served in the Civil War. So it's a great pride to have that particular photograph. But pensions are a wealth of information about the individual who applied for the pension. And after the war, hundreds of thousands of men or their dependents, in the case of Union pensions, filed for these pensions with the United States government. Veterans, widows, parents, minor children were eligible for pensions under certain conditions, and the files for these pension applications can contain a wealth of information about the veteran and the veteran's family. They contain information such as documentation of the veteran's military service. They include a declaration by the claimant, a statement of service from the War or Navy Department, a personal history questionnaire concerning their service during the war, affidavits by fellow soldiers, by relatives, by neighbors, attesting to the validity of the soldier's claim, where they were disabled if the claim involves a disability, medical reports of the veteran's physical condition. It just goes on and on. So U.S. pensions, they are a gold mine if your relative filed for one. If you find that a relative filed for a pension, you should get a copy of it if you're at all interested in their Civil War service, because it will tell you more than probably any other document. It's going to give you a wealth of information about that particular veteran. And to find out if your relative filed for a United States pension, you need to consult an index. And fortunately, there is one available for free on the genealogy website, FamilySearch.org. It's called the United States Civil War and Later Pension Index, 1861 to 1917. And it is searchable. And this is what it looks like. Go to the FamilySearch.org. If you don't have a membership, you just sign up for one. It doesn't cost anything. It's free. And then you can access all of these records, and you search just by, you can put in the first name, last name, birthplace, birth year if you know it, and it'll pull up the veteran if he had a pension. And this is just the index, so it will only tell you if the soldier applied for a pension and when. Also, if the widow or other dependents applied for a pension. But if you find it listed, then you'll know to go to the National Archives, which holds the originals, and you get a copy. Unfortunately, United States Army pensions, for the most part, have not been digitized, so you are going to have to go through the National Archives to obtain a copy. There are a few of the widows' pensions, those filed by the widows of Civil War veterans, that have been digitized and are available on the pay site fold3.com, but it's not complete by any means. I'm not sure exactly what the percentage of completion is, but I think it's way less than 50%. But it's worth checking if you have a membership to Fold3, or even if you don't, I believe you can check the index for free. So it's worthwhile to check out. Now, Confederate veterans were also able to apply for pensions. Although theirs were not available from the United States government, theirs were available from the state of Mississippi. Mississippi started giving pensions to indigent Confederate soldiers and their widows in 1888. Unfortunately, these earliest applications have very little information in them. Fortunately, most of the applications date to after 1900, and they are very informative. And this is an example of one of the post-1900 application forms that you had to fill out, and they are a wealth of information. They generally give the name of the soldier, age, place of residence, the unit they served in, names of unit officers, their date of discharge, their length of service, any medical conditions they had relating to war injuries, property ownership and income. If it's a widow's pension, it usually gives the husband's name, the date and place of marriage, and also the date and place of the husband's death. Please note, though, that if the widow remarried, she would be ineligible for filing for a pension on her first husband unless her second husband died. In that case, she could go back and file for a widow's pension, but as long as she was remarried, she would not be eligible. And at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, they have Series 1201, which are the Confederate widows or Confederate pension applications. And as it says here, in 1888, Mississippi began providing pensions for certain disabled Confederate soldiers and sailors, disabled servants of officers, soldiers and sailors, and widows of soldiers or sailors who died in service. The requirement for a pension for indigent Confederate soldiers, sailors, widows, and servants was incorporated into the 1890 state constitution. Over the years, the requirements for and the amounts of pensions were modified by state law until the law was repealed in 1992. And if you think that seems late, there were actually widows of Confederate veterans in Mississippi receiving pensions up into, I know, the late 1970s and possibly even later, because there were a number of occasions where these old veterans late in life married young women, and those women were able to keep their widow's pension for decades. So it's not that uncommon to see on up into the 50s, 60s, and 70s widows receiving Confederate pensions from the state of Mississippi. Now shown here is another Confederate pension application. This one is the pension application of J.E. Blake, who served in the 3rd Mississippi Infantry Battalion. And I downloaded this pension application from FamilySearch.org. It's very simple and easy to do. They're high-quality scans. If you've got a relative that filed for a pension from the state of Mississippi, I highly recommend going to Family Search and getting a copy of it, because it's very easy to do. Now, these pensions were initially, the applications were filled out at the county level, and then the county would send them up to the state. Now, there were cases where these applications failed to be forwarded to the state, so some of the county courthouses still have pension applications that are not listed in the pension index. Generally, only the ones that made it up to the state are in the pension index. So if you don't find your relative listed in the statewide pension index, you might want to check with the county courthouse to see if they have any pensions on file that never got sent to the state. And this is the second page of the pension application, listing the additional questions that the veteran had to answer, and then giving the signature of the veteran, and then the affidavit by the pension commissioners. And sometimes you will find that the pension applications also include additional paperwork that's attached to the pension. This is a good example of one of the later pensions. A widow in the 1950s was receiving a pension based on her husband's service, and this is some correspondence related to that pension. So sometimes you find really just a wealth of information in these pension applications. Now, after pensions, another very useful bit of information you can find is on the veteran's burial. And if you have a relative that died and was buried in the state of Mississippi after the Civil War, one of the first sources you're probably going to want to check is this book, Mississippi Confederate Grave Registrations. It's in 2 volumes. The first volume is A through L, and then the second volume is M through Z. And it just gives you the name of the veteran, the unit they served in, date of birth, date of death, the county they were born in, and the county they are buried in. Once you find your relative in this index, then you can go to the actual grave registration card, which is at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. And this is what the cards look like. These cards are on microfilm. You will need to go to the archives to access them, and they're well worth it because they sometimes have some very useful information. Particularly if you don't know where your relative is buried, usually these cards will give the physical location, the township and range where the cemetery was located, and some of the information from these cards has been put on the internet. The cards themselves haven't been digitized, but some of the information has been transcribed, and you can find it at the address listed below, the mscgr.homestead.com, and it's well worth checking out if you think your relative might be listed. Now, one other thing I will say, generally, wartime graves are not listed in the grave registration index. There are a few that made it in there, but the majority, I would say probably 95% or more of the listings in here are of veterans who died after the war. And then once you have, if you've got a date of death for your relative, another thing you might want to check for is to see if they have an obituary, because very often veterans' obituaries will mention their wartime service. These were, the highlights of a person's life. So it's not uncommon for their obituaries to talk about what they did during the war. And this is a good example. This is the obituary of Captain James A. Wiggs, and it gives a good bit of information about his Civil War service. You can find a lot of Mississippi newspapers online for free from the Library of Congress Chronicling America website. If you've got a subscription to the pay site newspapers.com, that's another source for additional Mississippi newspapers. So there are some digital sources out there and they are searchable by name. So those 2 sources, the Chronicling America at the Library of Congress and newspapers.com, those are 2 good sources for looking for online obituaries for your relatives. Now, finding the actual graves of your Civil War soldiers who died during the war can be a lot more difficult. Many graves were not marked to begin with. A lot of deceased soldiers were buried in common mass graves or into very hastily buried on the battlefield and were never marked. Or if they were marked, it was with simple wooden markers that very often rotted away in the years after the war. And unlike the federal dead who were buried in national cemeteries after the war, with Confederate graves, the effort of moving them into a centralized cemeteries was left to Southern civilians. And to give you an example, this is in fact a great example. This is the cemetery for the Confederate soldiers who were killed at the Battle of Franklin, Tennessee. It's in McGavock Cemetery in Franklin. And there are over 400 Mississippians buried in this cemetery. The Battle of Franklin was just decimated the Mississippi units that fought in it. And in fact, there are more Mississippians buried in that Confederate cemetery than from any other state. But most major battles have Confederates who died in them and are buried in nearby cemeteries. And lists of known dead from these cemeteries in a lot of cases are available online these days if you do a little searching. Also, if you go to the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, they have subject files on cemeteries containing Mississippi Civil War dead, which you can use. But you will have to go to the archive to access that information. Now, for Union soldiers, it's a lot easier. Most Union soldiers who died during the war were buried in national cemeteries, and the National Gravesite Locator lists all known burials in U.S. military cemeteries, including the Civil War. And I brought it up to show you what it looks like. You can just put in the name and do a search, and it will search every cemetery nationwide. Or you can narrow it down to just search national cemeteries in Mississippi. So it's a very quick way to check to see if your Union relative is buried in a national cemetery. Now, if they're not buried in a national cemetery, if they're buried in a family or a city cemetery in Mississippi, you may have to look for an individual finding aid for that particular cemetery. Some of them are online, a lot of them are not. There are cemetery guides for a number of cemeteries in Mississippi at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and you would just need to check with them to see if they have one for the particular cemetery that you're interested in. Now, another valuable resource on Union dead from the Civil War is the Roll of Honor. And it was published by the United States Quartermaster's Department between 1865 and 1871. Published in 27 volumes. That's how many dead are listed in this series. It lists the names of over 300,000 Union soldiers buried in national cemeteries, garrison cemeteries, soldiers' lots, and private graveyards. The burial records within each of the volumes are arranged in alphabetical order by cemetery. There's a modern edition of this 27 volumes on a CD-ROM. Also, importantly, it has also been digitized and is available for free on FamilySearch.org. If you don't have a membership already, I would urge you to go ahead and get one, since it is literally free, and the number of sources they've got available on their genealogy website is staggering. There's a lot of very good Mississippi material on there that I highly recommend. But this is what the pages look like. You've got the name of the soldier, their rank, the regiment they served in, the company, and the date they died, and then, of course, the cemetery that they're buried in. And next, I'm going to talk about, these are strictly Confederate sources that are available at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History that might be very useful for you if you're researching a Mississippi Civil War veteran. Now, obituaries can be a great source, or a casualty list from the time of the war can be a great source of information for a relative. This is an example of a casualty list from the 16th Mississippi Infantry. And this is taken from a wartime newspaper. And it lists the unit, the company, and then gives the names of the wounded, if they died, or if they're wounded. It usually lists where they were wounded. Sometimes it'll even tell you how badly they were wounded. But a lot of the newspapers from the wartime period have survived, and they are available online, in some cases through Chronicling America at the Library of Congress, or newspapers.com, the pay website, or there's even more on microfilm at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. But if you had a relative that was either killed or wounded during the war, it might be worth checking out to see if there is a casualty list for the particular battle in which they were wounded. Now, another very good source for veterans, and this is an item at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. This is Series 608, Miscellaneous Civil War Documents. And this series includes a wide variety of documents, some wartime, some post-war, and this is just a few brief listings from that series. You've got like Alcorn County, 1905, list of surviving soldiers. Benton County, 1905, list of surviving soldiers. 1891, list of Confederate reunion attendees, Mississippi soldiers who are buried in Kentucky. And it goes on and on. There's quite a bit in there. And there's a number of very useful documents in that particular series. Another very useful one, Series 354, the Confederate Pension Rolls, 1889 to 1935. And this list contains names of all the Mississippi veterans and their wives who received pensions from the state of Mississippi between the years 1889 and 1935. The lists are arranged by county, and the documents are nicely available online through the digital archive at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. So for one thing that this is very useful for, if you don't know when your relatives died, that either the veteran or his wife, if they were receiving a pension, you can at least look them up in the pension list, see when they were receiving a pension. Say if they show up on the pension rolls through 1920, and then all of a sudden in 1921 they're gone, either they moved or they're dead. So sometimes it can be very useful for trying to narrow down when a veteran or a veteran's widow died. So, and these are digitized, and they're available online at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History digital website. Now, another very useful item, Series 1215, Enumeration Rolls of Confederate Veterans and Widows of Confederate Veterans. The rolls include the name of the veteran or the widow, the state and year of enlistment of the veteran, because they didn't have to serve in a Mississippi unit. If they served with a unit from another state, but then later moved to Mississippi after the war, they would be eligible for a pension. So you will see men like, for example, here, Betsy Shaw. Her husband served in a South Carolina unit, and she was a widow, and she received a widow's pension. So it's not just Mississippians who are eligible for these pensions. Any Confederate veteran with honorable service that moved to Mississippi after the war would also be eligible for a state pension. And this collection, again, is available online in the Mississippi Department of Archives and History digital archive. Another useful source, Series 2202, the Admissions and Burial Register for Beauvoir Veterans Home. Beauvoir, was the post-war home of Jefferson Davis. After he passed away, the home was given to the state of Mississippi, and it was used for a number of years as a veterans home for veterans and their widows. And this is the register of the men and women who were living at the home from 1903 to 1957. And again, this collection has been digitized, and it is available online through the Mississippi Department of Archives and History digital archive. Another useful source, Series 391, Amnesty Oaths taken in 1865. These are oath certificates signed by male and female Mississippians seeking restoration of their rights of citizenship immediately after the Civil War. These are usually dated between June and October of 1865. Most consist of printed forms, while some are entirely handwritten statements. They usually contain the wording prescribed in President Andrew Johnson's amnesty proclamation of May 29, 1865. The oaths were administered by both military officers and county officials, with some including a physical description of the signer, which this example does. It gives the age of the person, their height, their eye color, the color of their hair, and also there was a place to list characteristics, whatever that means. And these amnesty oaths they're not online, but they are available. They are available on the MDAH website, which does have a name search feature for the oaths, so you can check to see if your relative has them listed. And Archives doesn't have these the actual oaths digitized; they just have the index. But you can go to the pay website fold3.com, and they do have the amnesty oaths, the actual oaths themselves, digitized, and they are searchable. And then this is an example of an actual handwritten application for presidential pardon from a Mississippian in Greenville, Mississippi. And the one last thing I wanted to talk about, and this is for United States veterans only, in 1890, as part of the 1890 United States Census, Union veterans and their widows were enumerated as a separate part of the census. And most of the 1890 census was unfortunately lost in a fire, but the 1890 Veterans Census did survive, and that census material is available. The 1890 Veteran Schedules provided the following information: names of surviving soldiers, sailors, and Marines and their widows, their rank during their time of service, the name of the regiment or name of the vessel they served on, date of enlistment, date of discharge, their length of service, and also their current post office address were included. These records are available on microfilm at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, or they can be accessed for free at FamilySearch.org. And this is the page you would go to, the search page, where you type in the soldier or the widow's name, and it will bring up the actual record. And again, I can't recommend Family Search enough. It is a very useful source for anyone doing Mississippi Civil War research, or just genealogy research in general. And this brings to an end part 2 of researching your Mississippi Civil War veteran. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please give it a like, because it really does help me to gauge the interest in these talks. And I will be coming back very soon with part 3 of researching your Mississippi Civil War ancestor, hopefully within the next week. So keep an eye out. I'll hopefully have it up by probably the end of next week. But thank you very much for tuning in, and have a great day.